From PoliticsPA, my name is Steve Ulrich, and this is Voices of Reason, brought to you by L2 Data. Thanks for joining us. Voices of Reason is a podcast produced by PoliticsPA, for nearly 25 years, most comprehensive resource on Keystone State politics and broad and liberty, dedicated to the freedom of thought and giving voice to the issues and ideas that have been shut out of our discourse for too long. Our goal is to bring you voices of reason from both sides of the Pennsylvania political spectrum. We want you to hear the arguments from those left of center, as well as those right of center. Our goal is not to get everyone to agree. They won't, and that'd be boring anyway. Our goal is to provide a dynamic platform for the disagreements amongst us to be aired with substance, reason, and respect, attributes too often missing from today's political discourse. And with the Commonwealth figuring prominently in the 2024 election, this is an opportunity to hear from those who are shaping policy and making news in the Keystone State. You'll hear from our Commonwealth's movers and shakers, providing you with all you need to make up your own mind about the future of our state and our nation. So with that, let's begin. Our topic today is education in the Commonwealth and what is happening in the General Assembly in response to the Commonwealth Court ruling that calls the state's funding formula unconstitutional. And now we're joined by Senator Tim Kearney. Kearney was elected to the Pennsylvania Senate in 2018 and represents Delaware County. He serves as the minority chair of the Senate Local Government Committee, as a member of the Senate Education Committee, and is vice chair of the Appropriations Committee. Senator Kearney, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve. My pleasure.
Could you explain to folks, when we read the report about the Basic Education Funding Commission, it talks about the adequacy gap. In layman's terms, what exactly does that mean?
So the easiest way to sort of understand what the gap really refers to is the level at which schools are funded, versus the level at which they need to be funded. And so the report and actually the court case go into great detail about that kind of difference between what we see, and that's where the sort of unconstitutionality of it comes in.
Will school districts be mandated to raise taxes because of the adequacy gap?
So it's interesting. The court case does not prescribe how to get to point to a point where we're actually constitutional. It really puts it on us, the legislature and the governor's office to sort of to figure it out. I think that we're talking. The report indicates about a $6 billion number to get to that level. We need to figure out how to do that in a way that makes sense, because what the court case points out is that the way we actually do the funding in and of itself is unconstitutional, and that's its heavy reliance on property taxes, which is something we really need to change. But that's going to require us to really put our thinking caps on and try to figure out, just because we've always done it this way isn't necessarily why we should be doing it now. So I'm optimistic that there's an opportunity right now to change the basic way that we fund education. Currently the state's part of every student's education is, somewhere around 33%, 34%. It wasn't that long ago that it was 50%. But we need to sort of explore ways to try to come up with that money to really make it happen.
Are there initial plans or sketches of things that you might be able to address early on and see where it progresses?
Well, I think with an emphasis on early on is really important, because what we have here is a problem that keeps getting worse. It doesn't stay steady. It's like the wonders of compound interest in reverse, right? So it's really incumbent upon us to try to come up with a solution moving forward. Now, we're in a unique opportunity time right now. We have a budget surplus of $14 billion. We've never had anything close to that in the Commonwealth previously. The largest increase that we had, or not an increase, but the largest amount of money we had previously was like $270 million of extra dollars, and that was during the Ridge administration. We haven't had anything like that since. So I think we're at a unique time where we have an opportunity where we can invest part of that money and start to make the move towards getting towards equity and allowing us to to really get the ball moving, get moving on really solving what the court has told us to do, because it's over a year now since we've had the results of the case.
The magic number we continue to hear is $5.2 billion, yet that's approximately $1 million less than a lot of education advocates have been calling for. Is this a situation where, with that kind of rainy day fund surplus of 11 to 14 billion, that there's some wiggle room there, perhaps to fill in that gap?
Well, I think there is wiggle room, and what's important is that the governor's budget, I think, basically the advocates think it's about $1 billion short of what it really needs to be, but it's something that can work right now. And of that $14 billion, it uses about $3 billion of that money as that initial investment to try to figure out how to move forward. So, I mean, certainly, whether or not we meet the requirements of the court is hard for us to say. I mean, the court's really got to tell us that. I mean, but the court was very adamant in terms of the way that they structured the verdict or the brief, and it wasn't appealed. I mean, it was basically accepted. So we're at a point where we understand this. And really the only fundamental difference being, we could talk about the report itself. There was a minority report that was basically the Republican camp, and then the majority report, which is a Democratic camp. And the big difference between them was actually putting that dollar number on what the needs really are and what we can really start to do. But it's a moving target, and we're going to continue to sort of work at it and get to a point. But the real losers all along have been really taxpayers and students in these districts who have not been adequately funded in terms of trying to get their education. So we have a mandate, I think, definitely from the court to move forward on this as quickly as we can.
You often hear the argument that Republicans don't want to throw money at failing schools. They're really looking at outcomes. Democrats are saying it's more of an investment into those schools.
Well, I think that term gets tossed around a lot, but I can tell you this: my schools are not failing. They're doing amazing work at producing great students in the schools right now. The amount of money that's been really pumped into the schools in the last few years, that was really had much more to do with the pandemic than it did with what their what their results were in terms of their testing, et cetera, et cetera. We could have a whole show about testing to try to figure that out. But the point is that the court was very clear, and the court said it was about funding. I mean, literally, if you read the report, they're very it's obvious about that. So we hear this all the time from our colleagues across the aisle that no one wants to throw money down a black hole. There's in Harrisburg, there's a very much a Philadelphia versus the rest of us, and that really has extended into Philadelphia and the collar counties, and people have trouble, sort of, despite the fact that we send a lot more money to Harrisburg than anybody else, but it's one of those things that just doesn't always add up. So
how does the discussion of whether it's school vouchers, school choice, lifeline scholarships, basically more parental rights, I guess, when it comes to their child's education, how does that factor in to the whole discussion about funding and the unconstitutionality of where we are today?
Well, it's key to the whole thing in a lot of ways. I mean, we have a divided legislature right now. We have a House that's controlled by Democrats, and the Senate's controlled by Republicans. It has been since 1993 in the Senate, and we're still figuring that out, what that kind of means. In the past, Republicans could pretty much do whatever they want, and they only had to worry about a governor's veto. Now they have to worry about actually getting Senate bills passed in the House, and vice versa. So that's a dance that's happening right now that they're still trying to figure out. I will say that back in April and May, I probably had more substantive conversations with my colleagues across the aisle than I had had in the previous 5 years. And it was, a basic understanding that, their bill stood a much better chance in the House if they had support from somebody like me to try to make things working. And when the whole thing happened with the governor and the voucher proposals and everything else, basically, as soon as the governor said he was going to veto the piece of the budget last year with that, all those doors slammed shut. All those conversations stopped happening. And it wasn't because of the relationship you have with individual members, it's because of leadership. I mean, leadership made that decision that they were going to, this was a toe the line kind of thing, and they weren't going to. So we're literally just now getting back into having those conversations again, with moving legislation from everything from hospitals to, a whole variety of things, local government issues, things that aren't even really, they're not controversial at all. They're just things that need to be done.
Is this the type of thing where the education piece of it can be for lack of a better phrase, a clean part of the bill, or are there going to be riders such as voter ID?
Wouldn't that be great? That would be. I mean, we would love a clean bill to try to move it forward. But, so much of politics, particularly in Harrisburg, is about leverage and trying to maintain leverage. And so the Senate is not going to, basically agree to something that the House once does without getting their piece of whatever. We're seeing that certainly with the statute of limitations bill, for example, which was a constitutional amendment that everybody agreed should go through a constitutional amendment process. Now, with the House being controlled by the Democrats, the Republicans are saying, no, but we need voter ID as part of that, even though the two don't really have anything to do with each other. But it's about that kind of, political leverage.
What are if you had to put odds on it, what are the chances of this being completed by June 30th? And if it isn't completed by June 30th, what happens next?
Well, I mean, the hard part about that question is that there's absolutely no reason why we can't get a budget done by June 30th. And it's this idea about all during the budget hearings that we had over the last, several months, there was all this discussion about where we're going to be 5 years from now. And I would say, well, 5 years ago, what were your predictions like where we'd be, at this point? The reason the governor does a budget for a year is that he does a budget for the year based on the criteria in front of him. And then, so we saw last year's budget, which was, from my perspective, very modest and should have been, more aggressive compared to this one, which is getting much closer to where I think we kind of need to be in terms of moving forward on these things.
Closer to home, you used to serve as the mayor of the borough of Swarthmore, and certainly just down 320, you run into the city of Chester. Mm-hmm. Two very, very different school districts. What's the best outcome that can be derived from these discussions for two school districts that are so diverse?
We have seen this. I'm not really currently involved much with the Chester School District per se, but I can use the same example in my own district. So I have the William Penn School District, which is the lead plaintiff in the court case, and the Upper Darby School District, for example. What we saw during the pandemic, when we were able to actually get them money that they weren't expecting, or money that could get pushed in that came from various sources, the results were tremendous. Just in terms of keeping teachers happy, in terms of making sure programs were actually working for kids. William Penn School District, we were able to get them laptops for kids, that they didn't have. I mean, can you imagine what 5 miles away is the Radnor School District? Can you imagine what that would be like without without the laptops and everything else? So it adequately funding them, trying to figure out that conundrum, how to do it without, trying to ending that reliance on property taxes, but really getting the money level to where it needs to be for these schools to literally function well is what's most important.
Senator Tim Kearney, thanks so much for joining us today on Voices of Reason.
My pleasure.
Now joining us on Voices of Reason, Representative Jesse Topper. He's been a member of the State House in Harrisburg since 2014. He represents Bedford and Fulton counties and serves as the Republican chair for the House Education Committee. He also coaches football at Bedford High School and officiates high school basketball and softball. Representative Topper, welcome to Voices of Reason.
It's good to be with you. Thank you so much.
First of all, for those of us that may not be as in tuned, what exactly does adequacy gap mean when we look at the Basic Education Funding Commission report?
Well, in terms of what the commission, what was brought before the commission in testimony, the adequacy gap represents the amount of money of spending per student between schools that are performing, high-performing schools and schools that might be in crisis or by test scores, lower performing schools. Now, there was disagreement in the two reports over how to come with the fix in terms of what is an adequacy number per student, because at the end of the day, a lot of the schools that are struggling do not necessarily represent schools that are spending less per student. And so if you just take the spending per student, you find that there are schools who are performing well that are spending less than some schools that are not. So what does that tell us? Well, that tells us that there is a gap in terms of what each school receives. There's no doubt, because of a hybrid system that we use that combines local taxes as well as state investment. So there certainly are some gaps there. But we also have to acknowledge that every school that is in crisis is not necessarily there simply because of a funding gap. And I think that's where you have some of the divergence of opinion when it came to the commission.
Was that the biggest difference between the minority report and the report that was eventually put forward by the Democrats?
Yes, I would say the biggest difference was what the adequacy gap meant in terms of spending per student, and then the amount needed to fix it, because there's a lot of structural changes that need to be made. We believe, at least in our minority report, pointed to that really need to change before we talk about that kind of a number going into a current system. The Basic Education Funding Commission has never, in the times that it has met before, has never brought forth specific numbers to give to the General Assembly. This was a case where we felt that it would still be in our best practice to recommend a formula to drive out the dollars, but not necessarily an amount of money, that to leave that to the budget negotiations. But the majority report, they felt that it was best to insert actual numbers. And so that's where you really saw the biggest difference between the two reports.
So when a layperson would take a look at the report and hear what's going on, they might say, so it sounds like my school district is going to be mandated to raise taxes. Is that true?
Yeah, we believe that in some cases where the tax effort is not as high, I do believe that you will see higher property taxes, and that's why, from a standpoint of how we're spending money in public education, we felt in our report that we needed to take a holistic look at actually how the dollars are invested, and perhaps look at reforming the system completely. It's very difficult to say that you're going to maintain any kind of adequacy or equality or an equitable funding system when half of it is based on local taxing authority, because there will always be areas that are going to be more wealthy, more affluent, and there will be areas that struggle. Look, I represent an area that represents poor rural Appalachia in some parts of my district. We're not just talking about urban centers. We're not just talking about the wealthy suburban, communities. Some of these rural areas simply don't have the tax base to offer enough support to really make what the government's investing work. And that's why I believe that there's an overall structure that we have to look at. I believe we have too many school districts to try and figure out how this funding system could work. We need to look at perhaps merging, consolidation, integration, ways that we can offer students not just equity in terms of funding, but equity in terms of opportunity, equity in terms of curriculum, equity in terms of programs offered. We have to look at all of that before we come up with a number, in my opinion, before we come up with a number that's going to, quote, fix the adequacy gap in Pennsylvania.
One of the phrases that we often hear being tossed around during these discussions is the phrase structural deficit in the budget. Is that one of the things you think needs to be addressed before you can start looking at raw hard numbers?
Yeah, I mean, I've never been a fan of the term structural deficit because we do a budget every year. So every year we can decide what our spending is and what our expenditures are. Now, but what I'll say is this. We have shown a propensity in state government never to eliminate programs, whether they're working or not. So the concern for many of us is that once you start a program that is a 7-year commitment, we don't know where we're going to be in 3 years, 2 years, let alone 5, 6, and 7. And that's very concerning to me. We don't know what the economic situation is going to be in Pennsylvania. So I do think we need to govern towards the future. One of the reasons we're in the mess that we're in from an educational standpoint is because back during the Ridge administration, I believe it was, when you had that big pension hike, we were governing in the present at that point. The legislature and the governor was governing based on the economic situation at the time. Everybody, the pensions went through the roof. State governments stopped paying their portion because the stock market was taking care of it. They governed in that time without an eye to the future. And now you can ask all of our school districts, one of the reasons why this gap exists, one of the reasons why we have funding issues is because of those commitments that were made when we weren't looking to the future. So that would be my recommendation during this time is, yes, we certainly need to make investments, but they need to be strategic. And we also need to make sure that we're making investments that we can actually commit to in the future.
The Basic Education Funding Commission allocated $5.2 billion, but that was about $1 billion short of what a lot of education advocates had called for. Is the appetite for the General Assembly there to close that gap at all, or would you lean more toward the lower number?
I lean more towards a number that is A, realistic, and B, will actually do the job. Until we start admitting that some of the problems in these communities and schools are not financially related, then we're going to be talking in circles. I mean, we have to understand that there are schools that are in crisis because their communities are in crisis. And there are ways that we can help these kids and these school districts other than just talking about pouring money into a system that in some cases is fundamentally broken. And I don't mean that as a knock on any public school. I mean, you can talk to teachers, you can talk to administrators, you can go boots on the ground. I've toured many school districts. If you ask them, is the current system working? They're going to tell you no. And they're going to tell you no for a lot of reasons more than just a number that education advocates are throwing out there as something that can fix it. Do they want more money? Sure, everybody wants more money. If you look at our budget, do you take and cut other areas of the budget in healthcare, in senior programs? How do you make this number become a reality? I don't think you can. I don't think you can make the advocates number become a reality, and I also don't think it fixes the problems that everybody thinks it's going to fix.
You kind of lead me into the next question. Oftentimes you hear that Republicans don't want to throw money at, let's say, for lack of a better phrase, failing schools. Democrats are looking at it as an investment. How important are outcomes in this entire discussion?
It should be the most important discussion we have. Opportunities for student success, period. We can't guarantee that every student is going to succeed. There are a lot of factors that come into play when it comes to student success. What we're responsible for as public policy makers is ensuring that every student, no matter where they're from or what their situation, has the opportunity to succeed through education. And if we don't take a good hard look at whether every student has the opportunity to succeed in some of those districts, then we're failing as policymakers. And while we look to improve the overall system, that's where we can look to find other opportunities to ensure that, look, not every student learns the same way. Not every student can have the opportunity to succeed in the same environment. And that's when we have to look for choice options for parents and guardians and other aspects as well.
That was going to be my next question, as a matter of fact. When you talk about education, can this be a clean bill, or is it going to be tied with school vouchers and lifeline scholarships and other parental school choice options that have been tossed about?
I don't know if it's going to be tied specifically to a program such as PASS. or Lifeline. But here's what I can say. Education policy never happens in a vacuum. If we don't consider it all holistically, then we're not doing our job as lawmakers. So I don't see any education funding discussion not including opportunities for choice, because we know that's part of how some of these students have the ability to succeed. Look, even if you're in a school district that is considered to be fully funded, that is considered to be an outstanding district at every level, that has great performance scores across the board, that could still be a situation that's not right for you as a kid. Well, what do? They have to have options. So it's not just about saying, well, these students are in districts that are in crisis, and so we need to get them out of there. That's part of it. If your school district isn't providing what you need for the huge, large swath of their students, then we need to figure something out with that district as well. But in terms of individualized education for a student, there could be a lot of reasons why a student does not function well or at their best in a traditional classroom environment. We have to make sure there are other quality options available for them. And I think that's where you can see the reports agree. Every option that we put out there needs to be a quality one.
How optimistic are you that the General Assembly can complete this by June 30? And to follow up, what would happen if it isn't completed by June 30th?
Look, June 30th has become, it certainly is a deadline to work for. I'm about quality of the product. I'm hoping, I'm very hopeful that those in the negotiating rooms will be able to see June 30th as a place that they can get to an agreement by. But I can assure you, I'm not going to vote on an agreement just to get it done by June 30th. We need to have something. Look, this is an opportunity for us in this time of uncertainty when it comes to education with the court ruling. I look at this as a time for transformational change that we've been talking about in education for years and have just never had the political will to do it. Well, now some of that political will is being forced upon us, and we need to take advantage of that to help our kids, to help our students across the board, to make sure that our system is what it needs to be, not just in terms of the amount that we spend. Of course, it costs money. We acknowledge that. Everybody does. But it also is going to take some other very difficult decisions when it comes to the delivery of education and the model that we use in Pennsylvania. And all those discussions should be happening right now at the same time.
Representative Jesse Topper, representing Bedford and Fulton County, Republican Chair of the House Education Committee. Thanks so much for joining us today on Voices of Reason.
My pleasure. Anytime.
We're back with the Voices of Reason's Roundtable. Terry Tracy, CEO of Broad and Liberty. Farah Jimenez, CEO of the Philadelphia Education Fund. Don Chavous, the founder of the Education Reform Alliance. And Guy Ciarrocchi, the Senior Fellow at the Commonwealth Foundation. We've had an opportunity to hear from lawmakers in regards to the Basic Education Funding Commission, its report, and what the General Assembly can do. Farah, what did you hear from Senator Kearney and Representative Topper, and are you optimistic about the General Assembly being able to accomplish the task?
So I was really pleased to hear both of them speak so positively and affirmatively of how important education is as an issue in the Commonwealth. Both seem really concerned about making sure our education system delivers great outcomes for students and families. And I think both express the inherent challenge in negotiating what does it mean to thoroughly and efficiently fund public education in the Commonwealth. And in large measure, it's a challenge because we haven't really defined what it is to be thorough and efficient, and also because of the inherent differences, as Representative Topper noted, that the way that we fund through our local tax system means that there are inherent inequities. So if you're in a rural county and your valuation is low, there's a limit on how much you can raise. You're in an urban county and maybe you could arguably raise more through your real estate and local tax, but then you may also have inherently more challenges because your students are lower income and the infrastructure is collapsing. And so the nature of what does it mean for the state, for the Commonwealth, to be able to fund education is really a central concern. And I think Representative Topper, what was interesting about his comment was they have to kind of settle on the answer to that question before they can negotiate what the number needs to be. So I think they're still far apart because they haven't really put into practice what does it actually mean to fund our public schools.
Dawn, you mentioned that as an urban Democrat, you listened to a rural Republican speak, and you found some common ground.
Yeah, so surprisingly, but I do think that I was appreciative of both what Senator Kearney and Representative Topper shared this morning. But what I wasn't hearing, and one of the concerns I still have, is the lack of participation from the public charter school community, which represents such a large number of constituent students and families across the Commonwealth. And unfortunately, we were not, and I'm saying we because I feel that I'm a part of the charter school community, were not represented in the hearings that took place leading up to the report. We were not able to participate in giving public testimony. Now, we all sent letters, who knows who read them, but I think at the end of the day, when we're talking about our public education system in Pennsylvania, we have to be inclusive of all public schools, and charter schools are public schools. And I think that as the Commonwealth is having conversations and making decisions about what funding is going to look like, public charter schools need to be a part of that conversation.
Guy, you mentioned that there are almost 70,000 charter students in the Commonwealth, 3 Pittsburgh City School District size. What did you hear, and what are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, cyber education is one of the many options that some parents have. And you're seeing it for a variety of reasons. I mean, it's an outgrowth of COVID and the lockdowns when we saw cyber school enrollment almost double. Because some parents made the decision, if you're going to teach my child online, let's send them to people that know how to teach online. At the same time, sometimes in places like Philadelphia, parents, guardians, whoever's raising these children, those people make a decision that for safety reasons, right? There's, heaven forbid, but it's less likely that your child will be hurt standing waiting for a bus if there's no bus to get onto and you're learning at home. So parents and guardians find a whole host of reasons to go to cyber schools. But to the bigger point, anytime we get into debate, and the debate is simply about how much money to spend, we're never going to have the answer, because never will we find consensus, because it will never be enough. What we should be talking about is accountability and results. Is each child given the opportunity to find a school that works for them? And how do we measure that accountability? The best way is empowering parents, because a parent will decide if it's working out. The parent knows what's best, whether the child's progressing. So in this whole debate, I hope that, look, I recognize things cost money, right? I'm a parent, but I think that we have to take the focus and put it back on results. Are children learning? Let's be less concerned about the type of school a child goes to. Let the parents make that decision. But most of all, are Pennsylvania's children learning?
And can I just add something to what Guy said? I think options are critically important to families across the Commonwealth, and particularly families in Philadelphia. And what I see this as an equity issue, because if you have the means, then you have more options. And I always, share with my elected officials and stakeholders in Philadelphia that where you live and how much money you make should not determine the educational outcomes or opportunities you have before you. It's just not, that is not equitable. It's not fair. And, I'll just give you a quick story. I just helped a student, a senior, who has a full scholarship to a university in Nebraska. African-American student, lives in South Philadelphia, could not afford his tuition for his senior year. And I just raised the money for him because this family is a low-income family. They don't have the means, but he's smart. He has a full scholarship to college, but can't graduate. We shouldn't have families in those situations. And there are so many families I know who I am talking to day in and day out who want to choose a different option for their child, but don't have the ability to do so. And that is not equitable. It's not fair. And there should be, to me, opportunity for all families, regardless of how much money they make or where they live.
Terry, we talked about how sometimes Republicans say that we're throwing money at failing schools. Democrats look at it as more of an investment in students. How important is the outcome piece to the discussion in Harrisburg?
Well, I think the encouraging thing that we heard from both Senator Kearney and Representative Topper this morning was that they acknowledged that this is a moment in time in the Commonwealth for wholesale, comprehensive structural change in not just the funding methodology of the schools, but also how that is tied back to accountability and outcomes. There's an acknowledgement there on both sides that that piece needs to be addressed. I think that's the first time we've heard that kind of language. You're starting to hear conversations about, well, maybe tying public education funding to the local property tax is really not the most equitable way to do this. Maybe there's another revenue mechanism that we should be exploring, which would be probably arguably the most significant policy change in the public education landscape since the introduction of charter schools in the 90s. So I think that's encouraging that that level of discussion is going on. I think where Republicans struggle is they look at the experiment that's occurred here over the last couple of years, and they've seen the federal government infuse the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania with $140 billion in incremental revenues. And yes, granted, it was in response to the pandemic, but when you think about the fact that schools are funded by local property taxes, and local property taxes were not really affected, right, didn't affect revenue loss by and large because the federal government, through other mechanisms, backed mortgages and tax payments. Revenue loss didn't really occur. So the school districts had an opportunity to spend an incremental amount of money, and it tended to be allocated towards socioeconomically distressed or over-indexed to socioeconomically distressed districts, many of whom did not improve outcomes. There was a district that we looked at in Delaware County in Senator Kearney's district at Broad and Liberty recently, and we saw that proficiency rates in math and English continue to deteriorate. And we're not talking about, it went from 60% to 50%. We're talking about 30% proficiency in math, or in English, 7% proficiency in mathematics. Those kinds of results, that's where you start to open up the conversation and say we're solving for something very different here than just our students are not learning. The last point I'll make is I think it's important that we also don't conflate the conversation around upgrading, investing in capital needs for buildings and infrastructure with investing in improving academic outcomes. I think they're two different conversations, and the state's fiscal position at the moment affords the opportunity to address both, but in very different ways.
You're right. No one seems to say there's a problem with funding buildings that need to be fixed. You don't want leaky roofs, et cetera, et cetera. But Farah, is this a moment in time? Do you feel optimistic? Do you hear the chatter leading you to feel good about what's happening? Or are both parties being forced to the table and having to make a decision they really don't want to make?
I think what is going to be challenging here is that each of the parties is going to need to sacrifice something in order to get to consensus. And so I think the essential debate is, how much outcomes focus do we need to make sure we impose on any additional increase in funding to our school system? And I think that's where Republicans would lie, which is that they would want to see a great amount of outcomes for that. Like to Terry's point, there was a huge infusion of federal dollars, and I think one would be hard to argue that really resulted in great academic gains for students in the post-COVID era, in part because the celebration was a ton of money coming, but there wasn't a great clarity in what is it supposed to drive, and are we spending those dollars in the most strategic way? And so celebrating how much money we put out there that's not responsibly spent to drive an outcome is, I think, in the end, not a great decision and arguably irresponsible, because it's not the best way to spend those dollars. So I think Republicans sit very firmly on that. I think Democrats would argue that it's been a long time of disinvestment. There are some districts that just have huge other social issues that they have to address, and their education dollars have to be spent in addressing those. And so in order to kind of at least get some level of parity as in terms of the starting place for students, you're going to have to probably spend disproportionately in certain communities. Rural communities, I think, and deep urban communities probably find common cause in that argument, and that's probably where Democrats are sitting and may want more flexibility in how those dollars are applied. And then just one final through line. Republicans really love school choice. And so I have argued that I understand that a lot of our organized labor in schools, our teachers unions, some very strong public school advocates are very reticent to open up the door to these lifeline scholarships, these opportunity scholarships. But in essence, the amount being asked for kind of to pilot is a rounding error in the overall amount of dollars that are poured into education in the Commonwealth. And so is it really a reason not to accept some kind of compromise from Republicans? That's something they'd have to settle on.
Let me turn to Guy and then to Dawn. We talked to both the senator and the representative about the possibility of it being a clean education bill and not being tied into whether it's voter ID, whether it's lifeline scholarships, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think?
So I think if you take the debate back to, are children in Pennsylvania learning? Does every child have access to a school that works? Then we can all debate the how. But if it continues to be a debate about how much money should we spend, or settling a score from 1999 or 2010, or when you guys were in power, you did this and that, if it's about power politics and parties, they're just going to keep fighting. If there can be a bipartisan coalition that says this is about children and whether children get access to a school that works, then again we can debate about the how. The reality is, in my opinion, again, I live in the real world. I have a family. I pay for things. Things cost money. Teachers cost money. Buildings cost money. Software costs money. But when I went to my first school choice rally, when State Senator Tony Williams was a state representative, when Congressman Evans was a state representative, Philadelphia was spending $8,000 a child. They will now probably break $24,000 a child. There are schools in Philadelphia where the proficiency rate is 0. And to Representative Topper's point, I have no interest as an individual or any organization I work with in pointing to a principal or a teacher and yelling at him or her. That's not the issue. The point is, if I look at this as a dad, if I look at this as a softball coach, there are boys and girls in Philadelphia that wake up every day and we send them to a school where we know that no one in their grade does grade level work. It is a moral imperative to rescue those children. So again, if Democrats and Republicans say, how do we save those kids? How do we empower parents? Then of course we work on paying for it, that it is. But is it just about how much more money will it take? We've gone from 8,000 to 24,000. I wish it would have worked. It hasn't. This is now not only about parents having choices. In many cases, there are tens of thousands of children in Pennsylvania. This is a rescue mission. So I hope the funding commission and all of it brings about that sense of urgency. This is a rescue mission. The parties have to come together, but it needs to be child-focused, child result-focused, not dollar-focused.
Dawn, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I wanted to go back to something Terry said, because I agree. I'm glad that the conversation is being separated, because there are students that are currently attending schools in dilapidated buildings that need to be repaired. They shouldn't even be, to me, still opened. And so, there needs to be significant funding to help restore or just create new spaces for kids or for students that allow for the innovation and learning to happen in a safe environment where they're not worried about lead and asbestos and, all the things falling down around them and leaks every time it rains like it is right now. So I'm glad that you said that, Terry. I think separately from that, there does need to be more investment in school districts, right? School districts do need more money. Philadelphia needs more money. However, having money without accountability doesn't work, and I think, I don't know, surprisingly or not, I'm agreeing with
I'm surprised every time I agree.
I'm like,
My wife said.
Money alone does not solve the problem. And, one of the reasons, I created the Education Reform Alliance was because I wanted to create a table for school representatives, public charter schools, and private schools to all come together to talk about what is working, what's not working. And what was so interesting, because I did an education town hall meeting last month, is there were so many similarities in all of these different types of schools. First of all, talking to the parents about why they decided to move one of their kids from one sector to the other, the school leaders who were all dealing with some of the same issues because they're dealing with very similar populations, especially in Philadelphia, where you have such a high poverty rate in our city. And then talking to the students, regarding what their concerns are as students going to school every day. And so to me, I think that it is, criminal for us to have a conversation about, more money without talking about how that money is being spent and to make sure we're achieving the outcomes, the desired outcomes that are intended. And I think specifically for Philadelphia, we have to make sure we are thinking about the holistic child and family. It can't just be a conversation about reading, writing, math. We have to talk about the social and emotional support. We have to talk about the food insecurities, the housing insecurities. There are so many other factors that are impacting a child's ability to learn. I think just having a conversation about, we need more money without discussing how that's being spent and how we're supporting the whole child is not going to solve for the problem that we all know we have.
Terry, we noticed that in the last session, it was really Lifeline scholarships that became the wedge issue. How does the General Assembly move past that as they head toward a June 30 deadline?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of hard feelings, but I think given the gravity of what's at stake and the complexity involved here, I think anyone sitting around this table thinking we're going to figure this out by June 30th is probably it's probably a lofty expectation. We need to get a budget done, but that's not the budget exercise in and of itself is not going to address the needs in a comprehensive way. One of the things that I think is problematic in Harrisburg is, to Guy's point, he mentioned the spending in Philadelphia is now, the average student is about $24,000. That's sort of a per capita number, right? So if you take the total amount spent and you divide it by the number of kids registered in the district, you get to 24,000. You look at some of the inner ring suburbs, you're well north of 15,000. So these are big numbers. They almost feel like private school caliber numbers. But when you look at the tuition rates that are published by the Pennsylvania Department of State, those numbers are a fraction of what is actually being spent. So we happen to look at Upper Darby School District, which is immediately adjacent to Philadelphia, and struggles with some of the same challenges. Their spend is about $18,000 per child, just on a per capita per student basis, if you just do clean math. But if you look at the tuition rate, it's less than $10,000, like $9,700 and something. So that means for all of the money we're spending, the amount that we're actually acknowledging is going into the classroom is a fraction of what we're spending, which is part of the problem. That is not easy to unpack in and of itself. As Dawn just mentioned, there's any number of other social challenges or socioeconomic challenges that are out there. And school districts have been put in a situation where they have counselors and psychologists and sociologists and sort of all the king's horses and all the king's men that are filling the needs that historically families filled or mediating institutions, civic institutions filled. So we're putting a tremendous amount of pressure on school districts to solve for all of these problems throughout the day on behalf of the student, number one. And number two, this is where we start to get fuzzy math, and it really messes the debate up, because you'll see education reform advocates saying, well, we're only spending $9,000 in that district because we're just talking about the classroom number. That's not really what we're spending. And so, and even when you look at the Basic Education Funding Commission, their numbers that they were using were 2 and 3 years old in some cases because DOE had not updated the data. There is no reason in this day and age why the Department of Education should not be providing the legislator with the most current, most up-to-date data, in particular given how much money has been infused in the system. These are the kinds of problems that legislators have to fix so that we're having an even-handed debate and we're having the same conversation, which is, I'd actually like to go back to a point that Dawn made earlier and just ask her, this sort of begs the question, this dynamic begs the question, why is it that the charter community wasn't invited to this conversation? What are the dynamics around it? Because I feel like we're not having the debate in a comprehensive way with all of the available information, which would ultimately lead to the necessary resolution. So we don't have to come back to it in 5 or 10 years.
I asked the same question, and I didn't get a clear answer. It was what was shared with me was the decision. I guess they came to a compromise on that part. So that means that there's possibility for compromise, was that they would, we would not be a part of, I guess, the public process. So like I said, we submitted letters, but we weren't able to actually give public testimony. And I do think that, people, for whatever reason, don't always see public charter schools as part of the public school community of schools that we have in Pennsylvania, which is a problem. But I want to go back to something that you said, Terry. You mentioned like there's money being spent on psychologists and other things. I don't know that that's the case, because I still have schools in my neighborhood that don't have nurses, that don't have social workers, that don't have those additional wraparound services that are necessary. That's why I started ERA, because I'm like, we need to think about education differently than what we've done. If we continue to do the same thing over and over, the same way we've always done it, and expect different outcomes, that's not going to happen. That's insanity, right?
So I think it's worth noting in both of your comments is the fact that when we look at the Commonwealth Court decision, in the 800 or so pages that Judge Renee Cohn-Jubileer issued, she doesn't give an actual instruction to the General Assembly on how to solve the problem of how do we deliver a thorough and efficient public education system. But she did go at least one step further, which is to say it's not all a financial question. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting that a lot of our kind of where we've landed in terms of the legislature's energy, and I think advocates' energy, has been on the financial question, maybe because people have felt, parched for so long, they're thirsty for the resources that they need. But you're both commenting on the way that the larger community and what are the ways that we structure the supports around students also have to be weighed in, and not always is that a financial question.
Yeah, and why can't our school district be audited, right? So that we can understand where the rest of the funds are going, because I think teachers need more money, absolutely. I think that more money needs to go into the classroom, and to me, that's the conversation we need to be having, not like, does it matter whether they go to a cyber school or a private school or a charter school or a traditional public school? The question is, what does the family need? What does the child need that is before us? And how are we supporting them and helping them? That's the conversation we need to have. And unfortunately, that's not where we are.
Well, there's a lot. I mean, a lot of good points. And I think the good news is a lot of common ground. But again, the consensus is, what are the words you keep hearing, right? Outcomes, results, accountability, empowering parents. If that's where the discussion is, then regardless of your party, regardless if you live in Philadelphia or the most rural part of Pennsylvania, then we're just talking about the how. If it continues to be about settling scores, power politics, or money, that's where things fall apart. So we need to drive it back. And to Dawn's point about, how do you have a funding commission that says we're going to take, several months and discuss how to fund public schools and not recognize the fact that there are now 170,000 children in charter schools, whether they're in a neighborhood brick and mortar school or in a cyber school. There are now more kids in charter schools than in the Philadelphia and Pittsburgh school district and the Reading school district, the top 3 school districts combined. How do you have a discussion on funding schools when you have 170,000 children in schools and another 50,000 on waiting lists to get in those schools without including those parents or those administrators? In a bipartisan way, a generation ago, Democrats and Republicans came together to create charter schools and then cyber schools to not only offer a rescue, but to say, how do we deal with all of these things? With children on the spectrum, with gifted children, with children in urban communities and rural communities. How can we teach differently? Team teach. How do you bring history and English teachers together? How do you deal with the really gifted student and keep her going? Charter schools have been doing that, in many cases very well, but not always. In many cases very well. The idea was that public schools, traditional public schools, would learn from that. Mm-hmm. There would be dialogue. And the truth is, when you meet teachers, they want to talk to one another. Administrators want to talk to one another. When we silo them off, we have this same problem. Nearly, 26 years later, 1 million children have gone through charter schools. Those teachers, those administrators have millions of stories to tell. What worked and what didn't. They were given the freedom to deal with all the issues. I mean, the idea that charter schools are these elite prep academies, they're not. In fact, charter schools are more economically diverse, more racially diverse, and in many cases have succeeded. Why aren't we learning from them and take their best practices and learn from their mistakes and bring that? Because again, where we agree is where you heard the legislators agree. When there's accountability and child focus, we can find consensus. We're just debating the how. When it gets into money and power politics and whose turn is it to stick it to the other, the kids get lost in the discussion and the parents get lost in the discussion. We need to bring the conversation back to this. 5 years from now, 1 year from now, how many more children will be in a school that works? 5 years from now, What will the test scores look like, and how do we get there? We could spend $1 billion more a year and all high-five each other and say, we're spending now more than ever. That's the wrong conversation. The conversation, how many more children that were left behind aren't? How many more children that were failing or succeeding? Then we can high-five each other. It needs to be child-focused.
We'll stop right there. Our thanks to our roundtable, Terry Tracy, Farah Jimenez, Don Chavous, and Guy Ciarrocchi. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Politics cannot live without data, and L2 data is the industry standard for having the highest quality and most comprehensive voter and consumer files available. We're pleased to be joined by L2 Executive Vice President Paul Westcott. Paul, welcome back to Voices of Reason.
Thanks so much for having me, Steve.
There are many factors that come into play when it comes to parental decisions on where to send their children to school. Pennsylvania has some of the best public and some of the best private schools in the country, but also has others that have struggled to make the desired outcomes even with additional funding.
You know, Paul, one of the things that Steve and I were just talking about during the break is this debate in Pennsylvania is unique relative to some of the other major policy debates like, you know, energy or, fiscal responsibility, managing the rainy day fund, and that partisan ID doesn't necessarily inform where you come down on the issue. Elevated school funding, school choice, what have you. It tends to be as much of a geographic consideration or a socioeconomic consideration as it is a political consideration. You know, there was, when I was growing up in southeastern Pennsylvania, there was sort of a bipartisan consensus that the school districts were underfunded and need more money, and the capital improvements were needed, and, you know, we put X amount into the state and we should be getting Y amount back. Steve was saying where he grew up in Huntington County, the idea of more money going to a Philadelphia or Philadelphia adjacent district or Pittsburgh district, you'd have folks storming the ramparts. What does the data tell us about how this geographic divide plays out amongst voters in the Pennsylvania electorate?
Well, I mean, it's fascinating because you're going, instead of looking at things through a lens of pure partisanship or through, you know, what we were just talking about with tribalism, where people basically say, I'm a D, I'm an R, I'm splitting into those camps and that's it. School funding and really overall support for teachers unions, Common Core education standards, things like that, tends to be split across Democrats, Republicans, and independents. There doesn't tend to be, you know, a big shift. There's really a few big factors that go into it. Does the individual voter have kids and grandkids, as well as does the individual voter, do they actually, you know, how do they fall socioeconomically? Are they putting their kids immediately into one of Pennsylvania's phenomenal private programs or private education programs? Are they in a charter school or are they in a public school? And of which there are many great ones as well. So when we look at the data, we of course look at this initial map here in our data mapping tool, particularly around party identification. But if you go down within the tool and just do a simple click, you can see the map shifts to now what's socioeconomic ladder. This takes into account a whole bunch of different things. You've got income, education level, home ownership or home price, as well as total net worth of an individual. So when you start really breaking down and going down to a district level or a county level, you could start to see that there are some similarities when you have these districts when they're seem to be on the same page. Maybe they're not on the same page Republican and Democrat wise, but they are on the same page when it comes to sort of socioeconomic status and wanting to make sure that their kid's school is being funded appropriately, because let's say 80 plus 90+% are going to a public school versus a private or charter alternative.
It's pretty incredible that you're able to get to that level of detail at the district level. So I'm gonna throw you a curveball here maybe. Can you show us William Penn School District? So William Penn School District is important because it was the district that was the lead plaintiff in the lawsuit that sort of initiated the current contours of the contours of the current debate, right? And what does William Penn tell us about the impetus for that lawsuit, the complaint that that public school systems, particularly in southeastern Pennsylvania, are underfunded, and what the needs of these parents in this community might look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So you get into the middle of this heated funding debate, and actually, before I go entirely into the socioeconomic ladder here, you can go in and we'll just quickly look at partisanship again, really quickly, and you're going to see a very common trend. Obviously, when you look at R's and D's, and again, it's why we go into the data and just give it a sec here, and you can see it's almost entirely blue. You've got a little bit of purple here, but it's also pretty heavily blue, blue, blue. But then when you go into socioeconomic ladder over here, when you're looking again at those factors of income, home price, things like that, now all of a sudden we're talking about a bit of a mixed bag, in that you have a higher income area here, a little bit here where there's warmer colors. Cooler colors are, of course, going to be those areas where you have lower income, lower net worth, things like that. However, there are many, many parents. It's a huge population of parents with children in household among these voters. So that's where you're going to start to see that sort of that major push, where they're going to say, even though this is a lower income area versus a higher income area, they're still going to have the same, in a slightly purple area versus a deep blue area. You're going to see, a very similar push for additional school funding and infrastructure funding, coming out of this specific school district. So just like when we look at house districts or counties or other things like that, school districts can paint a really strong political picture that's sort of independent of those tribal Trump v. Biden type feuds.
Certainly, we focus a lot on southeastern Pennsylvania, but let's take a look, if we can, out west. You take a look at whether it's the Mount Lebanon School District or perhaps Peters Township, just south of the city of Pittsburgh, and see what the colors show in some respects in an area in the western part of the state that is drawing a lot of attention this election cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to pull these up now. So we do incorporate all of these school districts into the file because we do end up working with a lot of these different districts. Did you say Mount Lebanon? Or
Yes,
which one?
Mount Lebanon and Peters Township, I believe, were the two.
Oh, okay, great. So I'm just going to select those two. I'm going to zoom back out to the whole map of the state. And again, we're keeping up that sort of socioeconomic ladder grouping. So we'll go out to the Pittsburgh area. And also, interestingly here, so you see much warmer colors. These look like these are higher income areas, relative to what we saw in sort of the eastern part of the state. However, you're also seeing, this is going to be more of a suburban area. This is going to be more, a little bit different. Although there's some urban areas within here. Actually, even within here, you'll see some of that. But you can see some of the demographics here. If I do separate this out. I'll go down to party identification, select here, and now you're looking, and you see you've got a pretty red area here, and then a very blue area here, but yet similar socioeconomic status, and also fighting for the competing funds, wanting funds for their schools, over those in potentially the eastern part of the state.
And focusing on the center part of the state, I'm going to focus in on Center County and State College in particular. That's just north of where I grew up, and you find that a lot of people who are working for Penn State University are trying to make the decision. Do they want their child to go to the State College School District? Do they want to go just north up to Bellefonte? They're looking at Penns Valley, and it's a much redder area of the Commonwealth. Certainly the area in the University Park part of Penn State is going to be blue, but it'd be interesting to see what it looks like in the surrounding area.
Yeah, absolutely. So I zoomed in here to State College, specifically around State College School District. So now I'm going to deselect outside of that. So that's blue right in that sort of heart of it. Then I'm going to reset here. And now you can see you've got some of these red areas all around it. You do have little pockets of blue here, here, there, but then you have these red district communities all around. So again, it's really, you have to look at the complete data picture when you're talking about these different school board races. So if you have people who are running in these areas, or if you're trying to decide funding around some of these areas, obviously looking at, politics is always going to be part of it. So looking at party identification, but taking a look then at some of the socioeconomic picture as well. And you can see that, you have some wealthy pockets here, but some far less wealthy pockets maybe immediately outside of it. It's kind of the story of Pennsylvania, where you have this sort of, a lot of areas throughout the Commonwealth, where you have wealthy Democrats within a pocket, and then you have less wealthy Republicans within other pockets in sort of suburban and exurban areas.
I think this really demonstrates why the complexity around this issue makes political and partisan consensus so difficult. But speaking of politics, Paul, let's pivot for a moment because we're just under 3 weeks out of the primary election on April the 23rd. Can you give us an update on what's been going on from a registration perspective? How are voters moving in the state? And also, I know in my county, mail ballots were sent this week, and I know that's happening in many other places across the state. So what are early returns looking like, and how will mail-in voting in the primary potentially inform what we could expect this fall?
Well, I know this is not live, so we're going, it's going to grow over time as you see this. But our team, I asked them to sort of hurry up this morning to get in as many of the early return data as we have. And even from, when we spoke this morning, we've grown the list a little bit. You can see you've got 3,700 individuals currently in, and we'll go down through some of who that is. You can see political party. The split is going to be 64% Democrat, 34% Republican. Now, some of this may be skewed by where the ballots are coming from, but there is a lot of distribution. It's not super heavily in say, out in the western part of the state around Pittsburgh. It's not super heavily in Philadelphia. So you are seeing a mixed bag of places that are coming up with the early return data, but you can see Democrats are outpacing Republicans, and that's what Democrats are, of course, looking for. But in order for them to, have the margins they've been expecting, it's going to have to be enormous. You could see it's more heavily women, but only by a little bit. If you go into the age breakdown, you can see it's heavily older. And this is something that we've noticed throughout a lot of early return data that we've seen throughout this primary process. A lot of the reason being that the primary has been, quite frankly, a little lackluster in terms of the competition among the candidates. So you're seeing sort of those known primary voters showing up again, and the 65 plus making up 70% of the early voters out there. And then if you go into sort of our ethnic categorizations, you can see it's almost 80% white. So it's older, whiter, not really reflective of the total diversity of the state of Pennsylvania, but it does give you an idea of sort of who's actually showing up in these very, very early days. This, of course, will transform as we get closer to the actual primary day.
And now it's time for our L2 data point of the week. And Paul, I believe you have some numbers about new registrations in Pennsylvania, people who haven't registered to vote before in the Commonwealth.
Yeah, this has always been interesting to me because every state across the country, or many states across the country, their Secretary of State will release the number of voters, and Pennsylvania is somewhat unique in that they'll also release the number of Republicans versus Democrats as part of it. And so we always see those numbers come out. And one of the things that we have as part of our file is two types of registrations. There's official registration, which comes from the state. And what that gives us is this whole slew of people who not only have registered for the first time, but people, if you move down the street, you're considered a new registrant. So what we do is we remove those people who move within the state or within the Commonwealth and just keep those individuals who have registered for the very first time. So these are people turning 18, coming onto the rolls. These are people who have moved from out of state. And so taking a look at that, I built this earlier so I could pull it up relatively quickly here, and you could see people across the Commonwealth, 169,000 or so individuals, and just some of the background on it. It's 38% Democrat, 32% Republican, 26% nonpartisan, mostly in suburban areas, but it's pretty evenly split, 34% rural, 29% urban, 50-50 split exactly by gender. And then the age breakdown, what's most interesting, and you normally don't see this in voter data, it's young people. So these are true new registrants. So 44% are under the age of 24. And in fact, the single largest group are those who are 18 to 19. You also have 15% of individuals who have moved to the state, and this is all within the last 2 years. So this is from general election 2022 forward. So what we're looking at is these movers tend to be more Democrat, with 41% registering as such, and 29% as Republican, 27% nonpartisan. So it's kind of interesting. You're seeing not just those those new registrants, which tend to be younger and also more progressive, but also people who are moving into Pennsylvania being more Democratic as well. Now, this is a small slice of the pie overall, but it points to the trend of of who are the new up and coming voters, who are those individuals, and then who are these people who are moving from, most of whom are moving from the region, many from New York, New Jersey, Maryland, and so on.
Paul, are you surprised at all by the partisan split amongst that younger voter set? Given how progressive younger voters tend to be, right, or at least are characterized as such, the fact that it's a 38-32 split is actually relatively close, and the large number of independents doesn't surprise me. But amongst that younger voter set, it's actually closer than I would have expected, given what the general perception is.
100%, and I think there is something to be said about sort of the fracturing of the Democratic coalition of African Americans, Latinos, and then younger voters. And so now you're seeing these millennial voters and Gen Z voters really who are coming onto the rolls. It's now Gen Z really who are the ones who are making up that much younger cohort. Those individuals are actually more split, and typically what you see are people coming in as nonpartisan. They're going to come in as independent and not side with a party. The fact that they're choosing sides is very interesting, and I think it speaks to the heavy political nature of the state, of the Commonwealth, because so many people vote because it's a swing state. It's very interesting. But then secondarily, and in a primary year as well, but then secondarily, the fact that it is as close as it is between Republicans and Democrats is surprising, because young voters almost automatically will fall into that Democratic camp. But it does show you that there's some diversity here among these new voters, of which make up the majority of these of these voters.
Fascinating.
Our thanks to L2 Executive Vice President Paul Westcott for another outstanding segment. Paul, thank you for joining us on Voices of Reason.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Our thanks again to L2 Executive Vice President Paul Westcott. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us on Voices of Reason. We'll see you next time.